And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And joining us once again is economist, professor, and writer Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV every Tuesday evening. You can also find his work at democracy.org, and he's a professor of economics emeritus, University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the graduate program in international affairs at the New School in New York. So without further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're always glad to have you, and we find ourselves in a fascinating historical moment in so many ways. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because I think it resonates on multiple levels that you and I deal with, is the interesting developments in terms of Donald Trump's relationship with the military. Now, I'm obviously not going to defend his, if true, terrible comments about soldiers who lost their lives in war and that sort of thing. But one of the things that's come up, and one must always, in my view, be skeptical of what powerful people are telling the press, particularly anonymously. But that said, some of these comments don't seem to be out of character for Donald Trump, shall we say. But the part of this that hasn't gotten discussed enough is Trump's ongoing friction with generals, and particularly that he made derogatory comments about generals in the past. And in Bob Woodward's new book, he is reported as saying that generals don't care about anything but spending money on military hardware. He kind of suggests that they have cozy relationships with defense contractors, and that they love to start, he has also said in a recent press conference, words to the effect of they love to start wars and so they can spend all this money. I have some thoughts about all of this, but I'd be curious to know if you had any reaction to all of that.
Yes, I found it interesting, much as you did. Here's the sense I would make of it. I think Mr. Trump has a pattern. It's a pattern he probably picked up and developed in his days as a real estate hustler in New York. But wherever he got it, it goes roughly like this. Find something that is outside the realm of what the normal political consensus allows, what in Europe would be called what the center left and the center right tend to agree on, the kind of cozy truisms that are thrown at each other by mainstream Republicans and mainstream Democrats. So, for example, you're supposed to say, gee, globalization is wonderful, and isn't it great that our big corporations are active all over the world, bringing us lovely, cheap products? Okay, fine. Mr. Trump says, I'm not going to say that. That's what they're used to. That has been the pap that has been given to people while their incomes have been shrinking, while their job opportunities likewise. So I'm going to say the naughty thing that their others are afraid to say. And I'm going to tell everyone that. So I'm going to go around, like, for example, he did in the 2016 election. I'm going to bring back manufacturing. I'm going to stop companies from going to China or India or elsewhere. I am going to recreate the job. I'm going to do all of these things, and I'm a dramatic person. You know how you can tell? Because I'm saying it. I'm even attacking corporations. Can you imagine? I don't know if you remember, but he attacked Harley Davidson's motorcycles and a whole host of others by name with all the cameras clicking. What is the record? The record is nothing. We have a bigger trade deficit today than we did any year since 2008, let alone any year since Mr. Mr. Trump became president. We have a bigger deficit with China. We have nobody coming back to count of, more people leaving, jobs not being created. On the contrary, on and on and on and on. So the reality is there's nothing there. He's just the usual. But the language, the theater for the politics, that's dramatically different. And that, I believe, is Mr. Trump's calling card. So now let's see how it works in the military. In the budgets that he has been president for, the military has typically gotten, get ready for this, more than they asked for. He has not opposed the military budget. He has not cut back the military budget. He has not proposed anything to reorganize who they are cozy with, who gets the big fat contracts. None of it. So here he is saying, I'm not like them. They are cozy in the military-industrial complex. I mean, President Eisenhower said it on his way out, his speech on the way out of being a president. Mr. Trump understands that that's very popular, that the majority of people have a deep suspicion that the military rips off the budget that is thrown at them each year. So this is a good player, just like people would like to see manufacturing jobs come back and more goods produced here by Americans who need the jobs. So he'll say the thing that conventional politicians won't. Your mainline politician, and I mean here Mr. Biden just as much as Mr. Trump, if it weren't Trump, if it were, say, a Bush, they would be talking about our wonderful military and the sacrifices that they make and the economies they're trying to supervise. I mean, they would say the usual thing. They would celebrate the military. Mr. Trump needs to be different. That's how he won. He won because the usual non-believable political junk coming out of the mainstream parties was being perceived by an ever larger majority of Americans for what it was, empty rhetoric. And he had to be different. And by being outrageous in the way he is, as, for example, bad-mouthing generals, which is a no-no for conventional politics, he's able to substitute the theater of something different, while underneath he gives exactly to the military, just like he gave to big business in the traditional way that Republicans do.
Yeah, it's interesting, Richard Wolff, because in bad-mouthing generals, he's not only sort of violating a norm, as you say, but he ain't wrong. I mean, that was my reaction, is generals do, in fact, have a cozy relationship with the military-industrial complex. They do know that once they leave military service, they'll get cushy jobs on the board of Raytheon or as a senior executive with whomever, Boeing. And so, in fact, they do like to spend money. They do, in my view, like to start wars for a variety of reasons. You earn your medals and your promotions in war. You don't earn them in peacetime and so on. So it's and I don't use this as a dirty word, but it's almost a mimicry of a populist position when he goes after generals.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a very, very important point. And I think he was doing that when he said he was going to bring back manufacturing and that he was going to punish Ford Motor Company for moving jobs to Mexico and on and on and on. I agree with you. These are popular. These are good things. The capitalists in this country, as they moved out production from the United States overseas, starting particularly they started long ago, but really accelerating the process since the 1970s. They all wanted us to be wonderfully applauding because it might cheapen the goods that come from China when they pay people, nothing relative to the American wage. They never wanted us to ask and deal with the question, well, that means our good jobs are gone. It means our family wage that supported our family is gone. We're all going to be gig workers. We're all going to be pinched. We're all going to get to be where we now know we are. No one ever brought that up. So he's the daring politician who says that. But let me give you the historical example of what I mean. When Adolf Hitler was in jail for having tried to overthrow the German government early in the 1920s, and was sitting there rotting in the jail before he got out and could resume his effort, he had a kind of epiphany in which he understood he had to come up with some way to be, quote unquote, popular. And the way to be popular in Germany at the end of World War One turns out to have been, no great insight on Mr. Hitler's part here, turns out to have been a socialist. That's right, because everything else, the capitalist system in Germany, the old Kaiser, the old feudal leftover leadership of Germany, had been really badly tarred with having gone into a failed world war in which Germany was defeated, and all of the old system was tarred with the brush of defeat, so that the new government that emerged out of the end of World War I in 1918 in Germany was socialists. And socialism was the new thing that wouldn't allow to have happened to Germany what capitalism had brought. Mr. Hitler's watching that. He's seeing that his own following is weak and small, and that the socialists are the government and are popular. So guess what? He conceives the idea then, it had been floated around in their party for quite a while, but he decides to make a major deal of the fact that the name of his political party is the National Socialist Workers' Party. Nazi is the first word in German. National is what in German means national. So he gets that word socialism. He even gets that word. The key idea is that he calls himself a socialist. We all know what he did when he came to power. He destroyed the Socialist and Communist Party. He killed huge numbers of the socialists and communists he could arrest and throw in jail. He was the extreme opposite of socialism and communism, but he understood that to build up his following in the environment he faced, he better look like, sound like, talk like somebody on that side of the political aisle, because otherwise he would not succeed as a politician. Mr. Trump has been doing exactly the same kind of rhetorical political theater to capture particularly workers who are upset about the enormous money going to defense when they can't send their kids to college, or the enormous money going to establish jobs overseas when the American worker is having a harder and harder time getting a decent job. So I think you're watching the same kind of disconnect between the politicians' rhetoric and the underlying reality.
That's very interesting, Richard Wolff. And I guess I would say, I don't know what it's like for the military now, but I know that in my father's generation, my uncle, people I mentors and so on who fought in the Second World War, every enlisted soldier kind of looked on the generals as those SOBs, those, they don't know what they're doing. They're sitting around on their tails all day in some headquarters with maps while we're out here. There was a genuine,
yes, of course,
working person's negativity towards this elite. I don't know if that's true now, but it seems that in taking on the generals, perhaps it's part of Donald Trump's broader pseudo-populism. It just occurs to me. And but I also wanted to mention it in the context of Hitler calling his party National Socialist. The right loves to throw that, up in the face of those of us on the left, saying, Hitler was one of you, that sort of thing. But if you look at it, it seems to me from a truly socialist perspective, it's a self-negating name, National Socialist. I mean, you're a nationalist or you're a socialist, but socialism, particularly at that point in history, was more, better than I, but seems to me was more associated with internationalism and a recognition of the international nature of capital and therefore of the working class. And it seems to me by crafting that name, he might have been negating his claim to socialism. But am I right or wrong?
No, you're right. I mean, for those, I mean, most Americans who hear this silly nonsense are being told that Mr. Hitler called his party socialist. That is correct. But to understand what it means, you have to know something about Germany at the time and the Socialist Party. And so let me tell very briefly, the original people that he gathered in his party included two people who in some way could be called socialists. They were two brothers. Their names were Strasser, and they were
Right.
the Strasser brothers. And he had to bring people like that into his party. Otherwise, the fascists would have had no base in the working class in Germany. The working class did not move towards fascism. It had no such history, it had no such interest, and it was very nicely represented already in the early 1930s by a large socialist party and a large communist party. So, in order for Mr. Hitler to get anywhere, he had to cut a deal with these socialists to give some substance to calling his party socialist in the hopes that workers would listen to what he had to say, which otherwise they wouldn't have. As soon as he became a party of some size, he approached the big industries of Germany, the big capitalists, and he said to them what they already knew. The socialists and communists have captured the working class. They have the mass of the working class on their side, and they're going to make you the scapegoat. You're the capitalist, you're the bad guy. You need a mass base. You don't have one. We can be the mass base. We have real support in the working class, at least some of it. We're growing. And if you give us the money to build our party, it can be your support on the ground in a population that is now turning sharply against you. The capitalists made that deal. They gave him the money, but they had a condition. You've got to get rid of the socialists, which he promptly did. And in his inimicable way, he had the two Strasser brothers, whom he had brought into the party, killed. End of story. And that's what he did to socialists and communists for the rest of his political life until the end in 1945. He went to war against the Soviet Union. He extinguished, and I mean physically destroyed, socialists and communists by the tens and hundreds of thousands in Germany. I mean, the idea of equating his nationalist idea, his notion that his regime was all about making the Aryan nation supreme in the world, that has nothing to do with socialism or anything that socialism advocates around the world, both at his time and since. And you know what it really is, this equation of socialism and fascism? It's the desperate effort of the middle of American politics, of the establishments in both the Republican and Democratic Party, who are terrified by the appeal of the extreme right for the Republicans and the extreme left for the Democrats. And so the way both of them have come together to prevent their own losses to their own extremes, Republicans to Trump, Democrats to Bernie, is by making this silly argument about an equation based on the use of a word that conveniently abstracts from what the use of that word was meant to accomplish when it was being used.
And again, we're talking with economist Richard Wolff. And you mentioned that obviously, as most of us know, the Nazi Party arose out of the economic chaos following World War I, and leaving aside Trump's alleged vituperative comments about soldiers who died in that war. The fact is, for example, my own grandfather, who was career military and a colonel, fought in World War I. He was injured with mustard gas, never fully recovered. He didn't speak of World War I with any affection at all. He spoke of it as a war that killed a lot of boys, as he put it, for what he couldn't see, in his words, is any damn good reason for it. And so the sense, and it was a World War I battlefield that Trump declined to visit. So, which I think a lot of people don't know, by the way. I think they assumed it was a World War II battlefield. But World War I is now in our list of, I forget Howard Zinn's terms for it, but I think the sacred wars or something like that, you're not supposed to criticize. But I think the sense at the time that it was against the interests of working people around the world was pretty strong, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Look, war in the United States has a very typical pattern. In the build up to it, and in the early months, maybe even a year or two even of the war, we're full of patriotic gore, as someone once called it. Lots of celebration, in which what people are celebrating is some kind of movie version of a war, in which people go and they have heroic battles, and when it's over, everybody gets up and goes off and has a beer, because it isn't kind of real. After a year or so, when the body bags come back, and when the real cost to the lives of the people who survive, not even to speak of those who die, when it becomes clear how horrible the destruction is, it begins to become clear to people that maybe there's a disconnect between the horror of what they're seeing and whatever the reason was, which they can barely remember, for why to go into this thing. And so you get the exhaustion with the war, and the fact that public opinion turns against it. That happened in World War I. It happened again in World War II, and it certainly happened in Vietnam. It was part of why those wars ended, and not just in this country, but in other countries too. So yes, I think you're seeing, and I think even Mr. Trump gets it. He knows that whoever is in charge during a war, whatever bump in the polls you get in that early phase, when everybody is full of the imagery of it all, you lose it and more as the war drags on and the people turn against the war, begin to realize it is not worth the death and the destruction and the wasted resources that could have made the lives of everybody much, much better. I think somewhere, again, Mr. Trump knows, even if it's only he has an instinct for it, because, if you're a real estate dealer, you try to figure out what you can say to people to get them to make that decision, to sign the document that allows you to say, I have sold this property. That's what he is. He's always been a real estate hustler. His father was a real estate hustler. He will say what's necessary to get the sale done. And that's what he does. He says what he instinctually feels will flatter the audience, will be what the audience hopefully wants to hear. And what he actually does is not connected to that. He's free to do whatever he needs to do, because the BS that he delivers is completely disconnected from what the actuality of the situation is.
But all he has to do is convince enough people that the artificial reality bubble he generates around him is a real thing, and he could get I think he could get reelected.
Absolutely, his job is to create that bubble, as you put it, and to make that bubble as attractive a set of symbols or imageries that he can, and get those people to vote for him. That the apartment he delivers to the person he sold it to doesn't have the qualities he asserted, well, that's a whole nother matter. And if that turns out to be a problem, and if the buyer sues him, he's got a phalanx of lawyers that will make it impossible for that buyer to prevail. I mean, he's learned this game. Whatever lie he gets caught in, he pays people to fudge it all up, to throw up noise that distracts people from this situation, to claim, as he does over and over again, that he never said whatever it was he was accused of saying. He's doing it now with the book you referred to before, the book, I forget the famous author's name, but he has tapes, this author, he know what he was doing. And so
Right.
he has tapes of Mr. Trump saying what he has said over the last 2 days, he never said. It doesn't matter because he knows that what his job is to pander, to get the person to buy the real estate, to get the Americans to vote for him because they like the image, they like the naughty boy, they like the person who's different, who isn't giving that pre-digested pablum that is the normal output of your mainstream Republican and mainstream Democratic leadership. They know that they have been hustled by those people for the last 40 years. They want something different. And the tremendous risk that the Democrats took in choosing another solid member of the mainstream Democratic Party is precisely that he will now have an easier time making the case that he's the difference people are looking for and Mr. Biden is not.
And one of the things that strikes me about that, Richard Wolff, is so many people in the sort of democratic sphere, social sphere, whether they're politicians or consultants or even some voters, many voters have responded with contempt and revulsion toward anyone who could vote for Donald Trump. And I get it on one level because obviously, he has hateful ideas about women and Muslims and immigrants, a lot of Hispanics, all sorts of people. So on one level, I get it, but particularly for the political class, it never seems to occur to them to think that a lot of people might know that Trump is crooked, corrupt, grotesque, abusive, all the things, liar, all the things you want to say about them, but in a way that some of those voters at least might be saying, here's what we think of you. We know all these things about this guy, but we'd rather have him than you. Now, what do you think of that? And I'm curious to know.
Yes, I think it's true. I remember watching, I don't remember which of the evangelical leaders said that it may have been, well, I don't remember exactly, but I remember watching a speech by an evangelical leader who basically said the following. Yes, Mr. Trump is not the good Christian we would want him to be, or words to that effect. But he is good for us who are good Christians. So this leader understood that he was endorsing somebody who did not live up to whatever that evangelical's stated standards of good Christian happened to be. He was clear. Trump was not that, and he felt the need to say it. But he followed it up with the rationale you just did, namely, I'm endorsing him, and you evangelicals that I speak to, you should vote for Mr. Trump too, because he's good for what we want and believe in, and implicit message. He's a lot better for us than those like the Bush family who gave lip service to us and didn't do anything. Mr. Trump is giving us way better lip service and occasionally doing some things that the mainstreamers weren't. And so we're going to go for him, notwithstanding all of the criticisms of him as a person, which we see and we don't quarrel with.
And paradoxically, the same people who condemn Trump, evangelical supporters, because Trump doesn't embody their values, yet they vote for him, are arguing that the left needs to vote for Democrats who don't embody their values for tactical reasons, which is exactly what these evangelical leaders are proposing on their side. So it seems to me there's an I guess I'll close with this and I'll give you the final word, but it seems to me that if we're going to have a transformative politics in this country, we've got to get away from contempt for working people who reach different conclusions based on the information available to them, remembering that we have very inadequate media to inform them, And B, we have to stop looking down. I don't know, I mean, as certainly powerful Democrats have to stop looking down on voters who, for example, you hear them always saying they vote against their own economic interests. Well, even if that's true, I would argue that's noble. That's if you convince people that there's something more important than their selfish interest. Now, I may not agree with their ideals, but they are actually acting idealistically. So until we can channel people's idealism as well as their self-interest along more rational social lines, I kind of think we're at a dead end politically, but I'd be curious as to your thoughts.
Well, your comments raise a number of issues. One, it's an old issue, but it hasn't been heard so often recently, so I'd like to repeat it. We allow private enterprise to control the media in this country. And the minute you do that, if you're a critic of capitalism, you are in trouble because the media are owned and operated by large capitalist corporations. The likelihood that a large capitalist corporation is going to give a reasonable, fair amount of airtime to the critics of capitalism is somewhere between slim and none. And that's what we have. We pretend that the free enterprise system makes us freely able to access different points of view, but we're not. We have a private system that is able and does not miss a chance to control and limit what you hear. Let me give you a simple example. I go to France fairly often because part of my family is French. If you sit on a Sunday morning in a French apartment and you watch television, you see a parade of news programs, a little bit like our Meet the Press and things like that. And what you see week after week are different political leaders from the different political parties. So one week on Sunday, you hear the leader of the Communist Party. And next week, you hear the leader of the Socialist Party. And the next week, you hear the leader of the Conservative Party answering pointed questions from the news media. But because the TV there is government regulated or even government owned, there has to be real, genuine equality of opportunity to get your voice heard, to get your opinions out there so that the public can listen, hear, and make an informed judgment. Nothing remotely like that happens here with the critics of this system, particularly because we allow one side of the pro and con of capitalism to own and operate and decide what's on the media. It's an extraordinary perversion of the notion of free speech or free enterprise to allow it to work in that way. And the other thing is, I agree with you. I think that the working class in America would have, to this day, voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, for good or for ill, had the Democratic Party been willing to cut the deal, to give to the working class what the working class wanted. In the first place, coming out of the Great Depression, the working class in America wanted to consolidate what they had won in the 1930s. Everything from unemployment compensation to the Social Security for the elderly, to the job guarantee that the federal government provided. Remember, the federal government hired 15 million people in the 1930s. They wanted to consolidate and make those permanent and build on them. Instead, what the Democratic Party proved from the end of World War II right to this minute was that not only could they not deliver an improvement on what had been gotten in the 1930s, they couldn't even protect what they had gotten in the 1930s. That's why in this terrible dilemma we are in now, or the equally horrible one back in 2008 and 9, there was no government hiring program the way there was in the 1930s. Social Security is under attack. The minimum wage, first passed in the 1930s, has been allowed to become a joke. As the years go by, the prices go up, and the minimum wage is not raised equivalently. I mean, the Democratic Party had the government as of the 1930s. It was what brought the working class through that horrible depression. It had the government to lose, and it lost it. And it lost it to an increasingly right-wing Republicans because the Democrats were in bed with their donors, were dependent on the same capitalists that the Republicans were funded by, lost their ability or their willingness to provide for the American working class. And so the American working class got disgusted, lost interest, walked away, or in some extreme cases, voted for the likes of Donald Trump, not because they were fooled or imagined that he was going to be their champion, but out of anger and bitterness at the betrayal they felt came from the Democratic Party.
And I think we'll have to leave it there. But of course, that does bring us to the present moment politically, and we will soon see how that plays out. So as always, Richard Wolff, economist, professor, and host of Economic Update, thank you for your insights, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ, and we'll have a chance to talk again before that election, and we can return to all of this.
I look forward to it. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.